The sky had been overcast for days, a dull gray that made the air feel heavy with impending doom. Within the sanctuary of the Refuge, a small, isolated compound located in the heart of the wilderness, the survivors had almost begun to believe they were safe. The walls were tall, the gates fortified, and the perimeter constantly patrolled. Yet, a growing sense of unease clung to the group like a thick fog. Inside the compound, a tense silence hung over the survivors. The camp had become a well-oiled machine. Every person had their assigned tasks, from scavenging to cooking, and from tending the wounded to ensuring the barricades held strong. But as dusk approached, something felt different. A sense of dread that could not be ignored, gnawing at the edges of their calm. "Keep your eyes open," said David, the leader of the group, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed the anxiety that had been building for days. The group had been on high alert after spotting some strange movements in the distance, and there were rumors of large groups of infected roaming nearby. His weathered face, once calm and confident, now carried the weight of an ever-present worry. The fight for survival had taken its toll on him and his people, but he refused to let his doubts show. Sarah, a sharp-eyed former military officer, stood on the watchtower with binoculars pressed to her eyes. Her pulse raced as she scanned the tree-line, trying to spot any sign of movement. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves, making it nearly impossible to discern between the normal sounds of nature and the unsettling sounds of something unnatural. "Anything?" David asked, stepping closer to the base of the tower. "No. I wait." Sarah's voice trembled slightly. "There, on the eastern ridge, shadows." David's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to ask what the shadows were. They were the very thing that haunted every survivor's nightmares. The infected, once human, now grotesque, mindless creatures whose sole purpose was to devour anything living. He turned to his second-in-command, Marcus. "Get the others to the barricades. We need to move, now." The calm that had prevailed within the camp shattered like glass. The survivors scrambled, gathering weapons, checking ammunition, and running to their assigned positions. There was no room for panic, no time to question whether they could hold their ground. Their lives depended on their ability to respond immediately and with deadly force. David paced the center of the camp, issuing orders with the precision of a seasoned commander. His mind raced through the possible outcomes, none of them good. They had faced smaller waves of infected before, but this felt different. The horde seemed larger, more relentless. His gut told him they weren't going to make it out without a fight. As the sky darkened, the first sounds of the undead reached the camp's walls. A distant moan, followed by an eerie chorus of growls, sent chills down the survivors' spines. Sarah climbed down from the watchtower, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. "They're coming in fast. Too many to count." The first few zombies appeared at the edge of the forest, staggering through the trees, their grotesque forms barely visible in the fading light. But as they emerged, the numbers became horrifyingly clear. They weren't just a few scattered walkers. This was a full-scale assault. Hundreds, maybe more, closing in. David gritted his teeth. "Get ready." The survivors took their positions. Guns were checked, crossbows prepared, and Molotov cocktails were readied. Every hand gripped a weapon, from shotguns to baseball bats to knives. There was no time for hesitation. Every person in the camp knew that the moment the first zombie reached the gate, the fight for their lives would begin. The air was thick with tension. Each heartbeat felt like it echoed through the camp, a constant reminder that time was running out. And then it happened. The first zombie lunged at the barricade with an ear-splitting shriek, crashing into the makeshift walls with a sickening thud. The others followed suit, their moans growing louder, their grotesque forms swarming in from all sides. There was no longer any semblance of a human passed behind those decaying eyes. Only hunger, only a relentless drive to consume. David drew his pistol and fired into the crowd. The first few zombies dropped, but the surge was unrelenting. It was like trying to hold back an unstoppable tide. Each pull of the trigger felt less like a victory and more like a delay in the inevitable. The barricades shook as the infected battered against them. The survivors held their positions, but it was clear. The refuge was no longer a sanctuary. It was ground zero for a battle that would determine their fate. The night erupted in chaos. Screams echoed through the camp as the undead clawed and gnawed at the walls, determined to break through. Gunfire rang out, mingling with the sound of tearing wood and metal. The humans fought back with everything they had, but the undead were many, and their hunger was insatiable. David's voice was firm as he shouted above the chaos. "Stay focused. Hold the line." But even he could hear the doubt in his own voice, the realization that no one knew how long they could last. In the distance, the sound of more approaching zombies could be heard, and it was clear to everyone, the worst was yet to come. The night had fully settled in, blanketing the refuge in a shroud of darkness. The camp's defenses creaked and groaned under the pressure, but they held, for now. The clash between the undead and the survivors had escalated beyond anyone's expectations. The first wave had been brutal, but there was no sign of slowing down. If anything, it seemed like the tide of flesh-hungry zombies was only growing larger. David stood at the front of the barricade, his eyes fixed on the relentless surge of infected. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his rifle, but he didn't dare lower it. Every few seconds, his gaze darted to his fellow survivors, checking on their positions. The last thing he wanted was to lose anyone. Sarah was a few feet to his right, her military training evident in the calm efficiency with which she reloaded her weapon. Marcus, his face smeared with dirt and sweat, stood by the gate, watching the distant trees for any sign of movement. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the camp, making it hard to judge how many more zombies were out there. The sounds of the undead grew louder as they battered against the walls, grunting and moaning with relentless hunger. The scent of decay was thick in the air. It was overwhelming. Some zombies had already breached smaller sections of the perimeter, and the survivors had to fight them back with all they had. "We need to reinforce the south wall," Marcus said, his voice tight with urgency as he turned to David. "They're getting through there faster than we anticipated." David nodded grimly, eyes scanning the barricades. He could see gaps forming in the defenses, places where the zombies' constant battering had begun to weaken the structure. But moving people around was a risky move in the middle of a siege. They had to be strategic. "I'll take the south side," Sarah said, stepping forward. "You stay here, keep the line steady. We can't afford to spread ourselves too thin." David hesitated, his protective instincts screaming at him to keep her close. But Sarah was right. Every second counted. If the south wall fell, the entire camp would be exposed to the horde. "Be careful," he said, meeting her eyes for just a brief moment. "I'll be fine," she replied, her lips curling into a tight, determined smile. Sarah signaled to a few of the more experienced survivors and led them to the south side. David watched her go, his heart pounding. He couldn't afford to lose anyone. They needed every single person. Back at the north gate, the barrage of undead continued. The survivors were holding firm, firing their weapons with controlled precision. Gunshots rang out like a steady drumbeat in the night, echoing off the thick walls of the compound. The survivors' efforts were enough to slow the zombies down, but it was clear, the longer they held their ground, the more vulnerable they became. David's eyes snapped to the eastern ridge, where another group of zombies was slowly advancing. He barked orders, his voice harsh and demanding, but there was an edge of panic buried beneath it. His leadership was starting to fray at the edges as the situation worsened. "Reload! Keep firing," he yelled. The survivors obeyed, but there was a look of exhaustion in their eyes. They were only human, and against such an endless tide, how long could they truly last? From the south wall came the sound of frantic shouting. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos, tinged with panic. "David, we need backup. They're coming from the trees." David's pulse spiked. If they were coming from the trees, then there could be more hidden behind the first wave, more waiting to break through. "Marcus," David yelled, "get a group together, move to the south now." Marcus nodded, his face tight with determination. He grabbed a few nearby survivors and rushed toward the breach, leaving David to guard the north. The night stretched on, and the barrage of attacks showed no sign of stopping. The barricades were becoming more damaged with every impact, and the humans were starting to tire. The relentless assault, the constant threat of being overrun, was taking its toll. The cold air mixed with the sweat and blood that stained their clothes. But there was no time for rest. There was only survival. David's thoughts raced, his mind calculating their dwindling resources, their weakening defenses. They couldn't keep this up forever. It was only a matter of time before the zombies broke through. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, there was a sound, a shriek unmistakably human, cutting through the noise of the undead. David's heart dropped. No. His eyes flickered toward the source of the scream, a figure stumbling through the chaos. It was one of the survivors, but their face was twisted in pain. Blood dripped from their leg, and their hand clutched at the wound desperately. Without thinking, David sprinted toward the injured person, shoving through the crowd of panicked survivors. The injured person was screaming now, unable to contain their terror. They're inside. They're inside. David's mind raced. The infection could spread in seconds. But before he could reach them, a hand shot out from the darkness. A decomposed, rotting hand that grabbed the survivor by the arm and yanked them into the shadows. No, David shouted. But it was too late. The figures of several zombies emerged from the dark, dragging the survivor into the night, their grotesque teeth glinting in the moonlight. The humans who had been close enough to help stared, frozen in horror, as the sound of flesh tearing echoed through the air. The breach was no longer just a breach. It was an assault from within. David's stomach churned as the realization hit him. This wasn't just about holding the walls anymore. The very foundation of their defense was beginning to crumble, and the human survivors were beginning to lose their will to fight. The battle was no longer just for the camp. It was for their very souls. The siege had begun in full force, and the hardest part was yet to come. The night was no longer just a veil of darkness. It had become an oppressive weight on the survivors. The air was thick with the acrid smell of blood, sweat, and decay. The constant screeching of the undead, the sound of their rotting flesh dragging against the barricades, filled the compound. It was a relentless assault, one that had no intention of stopping. The survivors, already weary, were now fighting not only the zombies, but also the creeping doubt that gnawed at them. Could they hold their ground? David stood at the north wall, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. His hands were shaking, but he gripped his rifle with a steadiness born of desperation. He knew that if they didn't act soon, they would be overrun. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. David. Sarah's voice was low, laced with frustration and fear. He turned to see her approach, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes wide with the strain of exhaustion. We can't keep up like this. They're getting in. We've got breaches everywhere. David didn't respond at first. He knew it too. The south wall was barely standing, the west gate was starting to splinter, and the barricades around the perimeter were being battered into submission. The undead weren't just walking into their camp anymore. They were pushing through the cracks, forcing their way into the heart of the refuge. I know, David said, his voice grim, but we have to keep fighting. You can't just keep saying that, Sarah snapped, her voice breaking. We've lost people already. More are going to die if we don't think of a way out. David's eyes darted to the horizon once again. The horde was still advancing, a thick mass of twisted, decaying bodies that seemed to stretch on forever. The camp was surrounded, and the only thing standing between the survivors and certain death was the fragile barricades they'd built. Get everyone to the east wall, David said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. I'll hold them off from here for as long as I can. You lead them. Get as many people to safety as you can. I'll stay here and slow them down. Sarah stared at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and sorrow. No, you're not doing this alone. We can't afford to lose anyone else. I'm not asking, David replied, his tone firm. Go. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. Then, with a hard nod, she turned and ran, shouting orders to the survivors. David watched her go, knowing full well the decision he'd just made might be the last one he would ever make. As the survivors moved toward the east wall, David took up his position, ready to face the oncoming horde. His hands were slick with sweat, but he kept his grip tight on his rifle. His mind raced, analyzing every possible way the camp could still survive. He had to believe there was a way out. There had to be. Suddenly, a scream tore through the air, sharp and raw. It wasn't the sound of a zombie. It was the sound of a human in pain. David's heart skipped. He recognized that voice. Marcus. He spun toward the source of the cry, but it was too late. Marcus was already being dragged by several undead toward the wreckage of the southern barricade. His cries were muffled as his body was pulled apart by the ravenous horde. David felt a pang of horror and helplessness. His second-in-command, his closest friend, was gone. The sheer brutality of the attack tore at David's resolve. If Marcus could fall, anyone could. They were running out of time, running out of options. Desperation fueled his next actions. He began firing into the oncoming crowd, each shot hitting its mark, but the zombies kept coming. No matter how many he dropped, two more seemed to take their place. His ammunition was running low, and he could feel the weight of each passing second. He backed up slowly, retreating toward the center of the camp. But the undead were relentless. One of the barricades gave way with a loud crash, and dozens of zombies poured through the gap. The survivors, now divided and scattered, turned to face the breach, but their efforts were scattered. Panic was creeping in, and fear was beginning to outweigh their hope. David saw Sarah leading a handful of survivors toward the east wall, but there were too many zombies between them and safety. He shouted at them, trying to warn them, but the horde was closing in fast. They would never make it in time. His breath came in short gasps. The weight of the situation hit him like a freight train. They couldn't survive this. They couldn't hold out much longer. There had to be another way. Suddenly, a thought struck him, an idea, a desperate plan. The fuel tanks. They were stored in a shed near the west wall, only a few dozen feet from where the breach had occurred. If he could get to them, maybe he could set a trap, create an explosion strong enough to take out a portion of the horde. It was a long shot, but it was all he had left. Sarah. David shouted, but she was too far away to hear. His gaze flickered to the west side of the compound, the path clear for now. Without thinking, he started running, his legs pumping with a force driven by sheer determination. He had one chance to turn the tide. But as he ran toward the fuel tanks, the earth beneath his feet trembled. The ground seemed to shake with the force of something massive, something terrifying. His heart lurched as a new, horrifying sound reached his ears, louder, deeper than the moans of the zombies. It was a rumble, like the roar of an approaching storm. David's eyes widened. The barricades were falling, but something else was happening. Something worse. From the dark shadows at the edge of the compound, a new wave of terror emerged. A massive, twisted figure, unlike anything David had seen before, loomed in the distance. It wasn't just a horde. It was a brute, a mutation, something far more dangerous than the mindless zombies. And it was heading straight for the camp. David froze. The real fight was about to begin. The roar of the brute still echoed in David's ears, its guttural growls rumbling through the night as it tore through the remaining barricades. The compound was in ruins. What had once been a refuge, a place of hope, now stood as a smoldering wreck, consumed by flames and chaos. The fire was spreading quickly, and David could feel the heat of it even as he sprinted away from the collapsing walls of the camp. His legs were burning with exhaustion, his breath ragged, but he didn't dare slow down. Behind him, the survivors, what was left of them, were moving with a desperate urgency, the fear in their eyes mingling with the determination to survive. The flames flickered like a relentless tide behind them, threatening to consume everything in its path. The brute's roar cut through the smoke and the crackling of the fire. It wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. David glanced over his shoulder, the image of the massive creature still haunting him. The brute had taken everything the survivors had thrown at it and kept coming. But for the first time, David could see it slowing down, its massive body stumbling under the weight of its wounds. The fire, though, was another threat entirely, and it was making everything more unpredictable. The zombies, driven by their mindless hunger, were still pouring toward the flames, drawn in like moths to a burning light. But the brute, more intelligent, more vicious, seemed to be focused solely on the survivors. It was clear now, they couldn't outrun it. They would have to fight. Keep moving. Sarah's voice rang out ahead of him, cutting through the cacophony of fire and screams. She had already gathered the remaining survivors, urging them toward the tree-line, toward what little hope they had left. But her eyes flickered to David as he caught up. "David, we need to stop it. The brute. It's not going to stop until we're all dead." David nodded, his mind already calculating the best course of action. They needed a plan. Fast. They couldn't just rely on the fire. The brute was still coming, still pushing through the inferno like it didn't even feel the flames. "We need to set a trap," David said, his voice sharp with urgency. "The trees, the terrain, they'll give us cover. If we can lure it in, we can hit it from multiple angles." Sarah looked at him, her face pale but resolute. "It's our only shot, but we need time to set it up." The survivors began to spread out, moving toward the cover of the trees, trying to use the smoke and darkness to their advantage. It was a desperate move, and every instinct screamed at David that it was risky. But they had no choice. The brute was relentless, and the zombies were only a part of the problem now. The real threat was the mutated creature, a force of nature that seemed to want nothing more than to destroy them all. David quickly surveyed the area. The tree-line was dense enough to provide some cover, but it was no guarantee. He gestured to a few survivors, signaling them to position themselves around the trees and set up makeshift traps, anything that could slow the brute down. He grabbed a nearby rifle, trying to steady his nerves. They had to buy themselves enough time to execute their plan. The brute's shadow loomed larger as it crashed through the flames, its twisted form barely visible through the smoke. It was faster than David had anticipated, charging through the remnants of the camp with terrifying speed. The survivors scattered as it drew closer, taking their positions. "Everyone ready?" David shouted. "Ready," Sarah answered, her voice filled with steely determination. The survivors around them nodded. "Now," David shouted, and the trap was sprung. The first shot rang out, fired by a survivor positioned in the trees. The bullet hit the brute squarely in its side, causing it to let out a deafening roar of rage. But that was just the beginning. The survivors opened fire from all directions, peppering the brute with gunfire. The creature staggered back, disoriented by the barrage of bullets, but it wasn't enough to stop it. The brute swiped violently, knocking down trees and debris in its path. It was enraged. David had one last chance. He sprinted to a small outcrop of rock, positioning himself to get a clear shot at the creature's weak points. The brute was now fully focused on the gunfire, and David could see the exposed joints in its limbs, the soft spots beneath its thick hide. The trick was timing. The creature's massive form moved with surprising speed, but it was also incredibly bulky. If they could find the right moment, they could finish it. The survivors were holding their ground, but they were starting to tire. The brute's sheer size and strength were overwhelming, and its ability to shrug off bullets was terrifying. David's thoughts raced. He had to hit it in the head, the eyes, or, if he was lucky, its heart. "David." Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see her running toward him, eyes wide with urgency. "It's getting stronger. We can't hold it off much longer." David looked back at the brute. The creature had already taken down another survivor, its claws ripping through their body in a blur of blood and gore. The remaining survivors were pulling back, retreating further into the trees. But they were running out of ground to cover. "Hold your fire," David shouted suddenly, the words ringing out in the chaos. He needed them to wait. He needed the brute to come closer. He needed it to step into the perfect kill zone. The brute kept coming, its eyes wild, its growls deafening. But it was distracted, frustrated by the survivors' attempts to evade it. David knew he couldn't wait any longer. He took a deep breath, steadied his aim, and fired. The shot rang true, striking the brute square in the eye. The massive creature screamed in agony, thrashing violently. For a moment, it seemed as though it might collapse, but instead it charged again, its massive form barreling toward David's position. And then, with a terrifying, guttural noise, the creature stumbled. It crashed to the ground, its massive body finally succumbing to the relentless barrage of fire and the debilitating shot to the eye. The brute's roar faded into a sickening gurgle as its massive body lay still in the charred remains of the camp. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. The brute was down. But the fight wasn't over. The zombies, their numbers still overwhelming, continued to surge forward, undeterred by the fall of their monstrous leader. There was no more time. "We need to move," David said, his voice hoarse. Everyone fall back. As the survivors pushed deeper into the forest, the remnants of the compound burned behind them, the night still filled with the sounds of the undead. But they had survived. For now. And as they disappeared into the darkness, one thought stayed with them all. Survival wasn't just about holding your ground. It was about outlasting the storm. And the storm, it seemed, was far from over.